we left with the question, who was culpable for Christ's death on the cross? And we said, well, yes, the Jews were culpable, right? Because they claimed Christ guilty under Mosaic law, right? And Rome was guilty, right? They claimed him guilty because he claimed to be a king, right? And we also said that we are guilty, right? We are culpable of this, right? We certainly need to look in the mirror, but who else was culpable, right? Who really crucified Christ, right? Who else is culpable of this? Well, let's look at this. Let's look at verse 10. It says, "Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer." Did you see that? God crucified Christ. Understand this, that there was no plan B, right? This was the only way to restore humanity back to God, right? When Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, right, with horrible anxiety, right, horrible suffering, right, knowing what was about to come, right, and he was sweating blood and tears, right, actually sweating blood, and he prayed, right, God, Father, if there's any other way, any other possible way, Lord, let me know, right? And what do we realize? That heaven was silent at that moment, right? Why? Because there was no other way. And then what did Christ say? He said, well, then your will be done. See, there was never a question of whether or not he was going to go through with it. But if there is another way, I sure would like to know. But if there is no other way, then, then I'm sure to go through it, right? It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, right? It is simply the plan of salvation, and there was no plan B. There is no alternative. And so Christ went through with it. In that verse 7, he said, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to slaughter, and as a sheep before shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Right? Remember when Christ was first brought to Herod, right? First he went to Pilate, but Pilate understood that Jesus was from Galilee, and Galilee was a northern province, right? So it was under the control, right, under the territory of Herod. And so, right, Pilate is under control, under the territory to the south, Judea to the south. Herod is under control. It's under Herod's jurisdiction, Galilee to the north. And since Jesus was from Galilee, he sent Jesus to Herod. And so he goes to Herod, and remember this, that Herod knew all about Jesus, right? He had heard all about Jesus. You see, Jerusalem was a very conservative place, right? Both politically and religiously. But Galilee, on the other hand, was a very different place, right? Galilee was known for its radical thought of the day, all right? Every rebellion that happened in that area, all of it always came out of Galilee, right? Every rebellion against Rome originated in Galilee, right? It was the hotbed of revolutionary thought and revolutionary action. And so Herod had heard all about Jesus, right? All about the big crowds that were gathering around him, right? All about all the healings, right? The gaining of thousands of followers, right? In a place that's under military occupation, right? When you have a local who is gaining a mass following, who's gaining that kind of power, right? That kind of following. Well, then you know that trouble could be brewing. So obviously, Herod would have been keeping many tabs on Jesus. And now here's Jesus, and he's standing before Herod, and Herod questions Jesus. And what does Jesus say? Absolutely nothing, right? He does not even open his mouth before Herod. Now why? Right? Is Jesus afraid of Herod? No. Right? He was told in Luke, right, to be careful of Herod because Herod is coming after you. Right? Jesus was on his way to from Galilee to Jerusalem. And what is he told? He's told to go by night. He is told to go covertly. Why? Because Jesus is looking out for you. And what does Jesus say in Luke chapter 13, verse 32? He says, you tell that fox that I'll go anywhere I darn well please. Now here's the interesting thing about that word fox. It's usually used as a masculine noun. But here in this case, Jesus uses the feminine noun for fox. So what Jesus is saying is you tell that vixen, that female fox, that I'll go wherever I darn well please. Right? It is such an insult to Herod. Right? It is a huge insult. Right? Jesus holds Herod in utter contempt. Right? And when he's brought before Herod, right, Herod begins to question, Jesus simply stands there and looks at him, and he won't even acknowledge, won't even dignify Herod with an answer. Right? Jesus loathes Herod. Verse 7, he says, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgressions of my people he was punished. And he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich of his death. Right? Remember, he was laid in a borrowed tomb from a rich man. Right? Joseph of Arimathea. Right? And though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Right? Though he did none of that, our sin was placed upon him. Right? There's truly no greater picture of who Jesus Christ is and what he did for us than this passage here in Isaiah. Right? Servant Psalm number 4. It is truly an amazing passage. And so we have the 4 servant psalms, right? The primary level meaning, right? That being the servant of Israel, or that the servant is Israel rather, right? And we are told that in Isaiah chapter 41 and verse 8, right? And it plays out that way all through those servant psalms. Matter of fact, all through that last half of Isaiah chapter 40 through 66, we see this as as Israel on the primary level, but Jesus on that secondary level. We see it played out over and over again, right? And so they also foreshadow the greater salvation that is to come through Jesus Christ, who is the Messiah. Right? And Jesus knows this, right? Jesus knows who his audience is, right? And listen to this. We'll close with this, but turn over with me to Luke chapter 4, right? Jesus has been teaching and preaching in Galilee. And in Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, right, Jesus has gone back to Nazareth, right? The place where he grew up, the place where he lived all of his life. And he went back to Nazareth in verse 16 of chapter 4 of Luke. It says this. It says he went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. Verse 17, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, and unrolling it, he found the place where it was written. Now think about this. Jesus has been teaching all over Galilee, and now he has gone back home. Listen, Jesus is just a local boy, right? He is a local boy that has come back home, and by this time word has spread all around Galilee about him, including in Nazareth, right? And he has come back, and he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, and the rabbi came to him and says, Jesus, oh, it's so good to see you. Thanks for coming home. It's so great to see you. Right now, understand this. This may have been the very same rabbi who taught Jesus how to read and write, right? Remember, in a synagogue, right, it was the rabbi who taught the kids how to read and write. And being Nazareth, being a very small town, it only had one synagogue, probably only had one rabbi in it, and this could have been the very same rabbi who had been teaching there for the last 30 years. So this could have been this very same rabbi who taught Jesus how to read and write. And so he comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, it's so good to see you, right? We've heard so many great things about you. Would you mind doing the readings today? And so it's a synagogue service. It is on the Sabbath. And there is the reading from the Torah, right? Genesis through Deuteronomy. And then there's always an accompanying reading from the prophets that's called the Haftorah. And so you have 2 readings that are thematically linked. A reading from the Torah and then a reading from the Haftorah, which is a prophet that is thematically linked to that reading in the Torah. And then a sermon would be preached or teach after that. And so the rabbi said to Jesus, asked Jesus if he would do one of the readings and then share a few words. And Jesus said, I would be happy to. And so as the service began, Jesus stood up to read the selected passage that he had been asked to do. Right? And so the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, it was handed to him. And he was there to read, he was going to read the second reading, right? The Torah reading, and then the second reading from Isaiah would come. Now understand this is a fixed reading, right? It is not by chance, right? Jesus didn't say, okay, let me get Isaiah, let me flip through and find something that looks like it might fit me, might match me, and then I'll proclaim something. No, this is a fixed reading. In other words, this was the reading that was for that day, right? The Torah reading would start on the first Sabbath of the year, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and would go congruently over those 12 months until you finish with Deuteronomy. It was a fixed reading, and then there was a fixed reading from the Haftorah, right, the prophets that would accompany that reading. It never changed. Even to this day, it has not changed. This is a fixed reading. And so Jesus wasn't looking back trying to say, hey, can I find a reading? No, this is a fixed reading, right? And 60% of those readings came from the prophet Isaiah. And so if you had a reading for that day, for that Sabbath, most likely 60% of the time, it was coming from Isaiah. And so Jesus grabs the scroll of Isaiah. It is the fixed reading for that day, and he begins to read it. He stood up and he's waiting there. He's looking out of the crowd. Remember, Jesus is a master teacher. He is a master orator. And so he's looking at the crowd and he's waiting. And he's allowing them to build anticipation and maybe even a little bit of uncomfortableness, right? Just really listening in and waiting. And then Jesus begins and he reads this. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of the sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Right? He is reading Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. And did you notice how he read it? Right? The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me. Why? Because he has anointed me to preach the good news. Verse 20. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Right? He didn't sit down in the congregation. No, he was sitting in the teacher's seat that was directly on front, that was up on the platform where he would preach from, where he would teach from. Right? In the synagogue, you would stand for the Torah reading, for the Haftorah reading, for the selected reading of that day, and then you would sit in the preacher's seat, the teacher's seat that would be on the platform for you to teach from. And that's where Jesus sat. And then notice this. It says, the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. Why? Because they heard the inflection in his voice. Right? They heard the emphasis on the word me. Right, and what does it say over in Isaiah 61? You don't have to turn there, stay here in Luke chapter 4. But Isaiah 61, verse 1 says this, says, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the broken heart, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of the spirit of despair. Now listen to this. Who is the me in Isaiah 61? Remember, it is the servant Israel, right? We made that clear. Isaiah 41 verse 8, when the servant is Israel. But on a second level, it is the Messiah. And understand this, that everybody knew that, right? It is a messianic reading from Isaiah, right? Even in Jesus' time, everybody understood this, right? And so when Jesus is reading this and he was referring to himself, he is proclaiming to be the Messiah. And everybody who's sitting in that synagogue understands this, and knows this. Everybody gets it. And when he sits down, right, he sits in that preacher seat, in that teacher seat, and the whole synagogue is fixed on him. What is he going to say now? Right? And in case anyone missed the point, Jesus begins his sermon by saying, verse 21 of chapter 4 of Luke, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And nobody can doubt what Jesus is saying at this point. And that is the opening line of Jesus' sermon. Right? And understand this, we only have the opening line. Right? Jesus would have taught for about 20 minutes here. And no doubt he would have backed everything up with more scripture and would have proved his case with his miracles and with his teaching and with all of his proclamations. And verse 22 says, "All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips." Right? It would have been an amazing sermon. Right? We only have the first line, but that 20 minutes would have been an amazing sermon. Right? Isaiah 61 verses 1 and 2, right? Referring to the servant Israel, but now also referring to Jesus on a second level. And everybody in that synagogue would have got it. And everyone in that synagogue was amazed by that teaching. But after that, the people who were in Nazareth got wind of what he was teaching. And many people in Nazareth were very offended by what Jesus said. And they said this. They said, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" In other words, who does this guy think he is? Who does this Jesus think he is? Right? We've known him since he was a little boy. Right? Remember, he used to play with my little boy Jacob. Right? Remember, he used to go and he would rip the legs off my son's G.I. Joe dolls. Right? And this is the guy? The people were looking at him and they were very disapproving of him. And in verse 23 it says this, "Jesus said to them, 'Surely you will quote this proverb to me, Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, 'Do you hear in your hometown what we have heard, what you did in Capernaum?'" Jesus continued, verse 24, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown." Right? Jesus is laying into them. And they are insulted, and they are ultimately livid, and they drag him out of town, and they are ready to toss Jesus over the cliff. But then with authority, Jesus said, "Enough!" And Jesus got up and he walked away, right? And the crowd split as he walked through that crowd. As far as we know, Jesus never went back down to Nazareth again. Jesus never went back home to Nazareth again. Right? What a scene. And it ties directly into Isaiah chapter 61. And so chapters 40 through 66 of Isaiah, right? The genre is poetry, right? And it's written in a very poetic form. And the theme is grace. God is going to save his people from captivity in Babylon. He's going to bring them back in the fold. He is going to restore Jerusalem. And there's going to be freedom once again in God. But in a much bigger way, right? On a much grander scale, later on, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, God's Son, will save all of humanity from its captivity in sin and will bring them back to freedom in Christ, assuming that they accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. Right? And that whole portion of Isaiah focuses on that. And so we have truly a great book in the book of Isaiah, right? A book that, although not written first among the prophets, right? It's not the first prophetic book written. It is placed here first because of the greatness of that book, right? Because of the themes that take place, right? That theme of judgment and that theme of grace, right? Those same themes that will carry on through the remainder of the prophets. It is dealt with here, and Isaiah does it in such a comprehensive way, in such a memorable way, that it's placed first among the prophets. And it is truly a great, great, great book. We have Isaiah, the thundering